This is Mae Brussell, and it's broadcast number 661. It's August the 6th, 1984. This time last year, that's the way we usually begin. This time last year, I had a detailed chart on that program last August about the connections of Johnny Carson and the money that went to DeLorean Motors and the relationship of Carson to his partner in the banking business, Henry Bushkin, Jack Catane Jr. of organized crime, and the fellow from the part of TMX company, shares owned by DeLorean that went channeled down to money to start DeLorean Motors, and Robert Durand, and the connection of these various people in Hollywood, in Chicago, in Ireland, and the relationship of those people to funding the DeLorean Motors. And of course there was a lot more to the DeLorean Motors than is ever going to come out in this trial. The trial just is limited to whether or not he was buying these narcotics on his own, and the secret of the real John DeLorean isn't going to come out at all, I'm sure. Also last year I was talking about missing millions and billions, specifically the Vatican billions, the DeLorean millions, Mark Rich's millions. Those things are still secret. It's a year later and they're still secret. I was discussing the DeLorean investigation written up in the Monterey Herald, where they were looking for $17.5 million that was missing. They still haven't accounted for that money, and I had tried to explain leads that I had to the Detroit FBI and called them looking for money in a Swiss bank. I had the name of the courier and the recipient of this money that allegedly came from Klaus Barbie and was put in a Swiss bank. Of course, they would never investigate that. Charges against Johnny Carson's lawyer were dismissed, Henry Bushkin, and his connections with the bank violations were dropped. I also was talking a year ago about Henry Kissinger and his oil deals in the early 1970s with the inflated oil prices, dealing oil to Iran through the Mideast crisis, which is an important story, and this comes up again with Mark Rich, who made his profits at the time of the Middle East crisis, and also when Henry Kissinger was advising Richard Nixon during the Watergate crisis, possibly go to war in the Mideast, and that would divert the Watergate scandal. That was a possibility that people in Washington were afraid of. He'd use the war as a diversionary against the impeachment process, and that came out this week in part of the transcript of the hearings on the air. But the inflated oil prices that we were left with after 1973-74 had to do with Henry Kissinger and Mark Rich and Gerald Ford, that combine of people who have profited by various things that they've done together through the years that they have never been. Well, Mark Rich is wanted in trial for his various activities, but he's wanted in New York. But this last week, Mark Rich had a subpoena sent to the Swiss government to have him sent home extradited for trial. For the figure varies between $60 to $80 million of taxes unpaid in this country, and the Swiss government refused to take the subpoena because it was written in English, and they said that's not the official Swiss languages. It should be in German, French, or Italian, and our United States government lawyers don't even know that. So what happened was the subpoena was sent home, and they said that would set us back. Well, in one day you can get a translator, so I don't know what would set us back. Now, because of certain circumstances that have happened this week and stories in the news, I have to back up. I want to continue the Henry Kissinger story I started 2 weeks ago on the Anglo connections, the English connections and Nazi connections to Henry Kissinger. I didn't forget it, and I promise you I'll be doing it soon. And also, last week I started on the appointments of Ronald Reagan. We went down a bunch of them, just their names, and I'm going to go to them in detail. Ann Burford is down and out of her ocean and atmospheric appointment, so we don't have to worry about her, just who follows her. But as I say, there were stories in the news this week that take precedence even over the appointments, so I'm going to run down those and then go back to the appointments if I have time at the end of the program, but we will continue those. This is the anniversary this week of the bombing at Hiroshima. There's going to be a lot of celebrations on the news, and by the time some of you get these tapes, the news will be over about that. There is a book called Hot Embers, The Chronicle of a Covert Race for Atomic Weapons. It's published in Moscow, and it's a book that came out this year on the grab to make the first atomic bombs and how the United States and British and the Germans were working to make the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. Now, there's an article in New Times magazine called Shadows on a Hiroshima Bridge. And the article states April 25th, 1945, humankind will never forget it. That's the day that the Russians met the Americans and British to defeat the Hitler's Reich. That's where they all met together in Germany, plowing from the east and west, April 25th, 1945. The article says, few people know, however, that on that same distant April day when these people were meeting, delegates were listening to recordings of President Truman's speech in San Francisco. The United Nations chapter was opening up on that day, April 25th, 1945, starting the United Nations with a conference to draft a charter for the international organization. But while the charter meeting was going and Truman had made a recording for those people, he was in Washington, D.C., meeting with War Secretary Henry Stimson and General Leslie Groves in the Oval Room of the White House, and they were talking about making and delivering the atomic bomb. In 4 months, this book states, Stimson reported the United States would in all probability have the most powerful weapon mankind had ever known. Now, Henry Stimson was the man behind the power behind Herbert Hoover from World War I and behind the political escalation of John J. McCloy, who later was on the Warren Commission. He was the American Chancellor to Germany, and he was to release the top Nazis from the German prisons. While they were meeting, they were discussing what they would do about the atomic bomb and that they would demonstrate the weapon to blackmail the Soviet Union. The Manhattan Project was going ahead, and they had $2 billion earmarked to make those bombs that were to fall. Now, there is a man who was in Hollywood making movies, Emmanuel Zacina, and he wanted me to work on a story with him. He was from Nicaragua, and we'd done that Howard Hughes movie, and he told me that the Germans had the atomic bomb and that this is in the National Archives in Washington, but they didn't want to drop it in Europe because they were afraid that then Europe would be polluted or radiation. So they had delivered it to the United States. He said they referred to it as their little pineapple, delivered it. We didn't make that bomb for the Manhattan Project. According to him, in the National Archives is evidence that the bomb was all ready to go. And in this story, this new book that has just come out on making the bomb, it tells how the president sat with Mr. Stimson discussing what they would do in a few months with the bomb. Now, the book goes on. Meanwhile, the Manhattan Project was being rushed along when, as soon as the war was over, the Nazi uranium project didn't bear fruit, but the Manhattan Project was rushed along. For in 1944, when the Red Army was inflicting on the fascists one defeat after another, the American scientists voiced doubts as to whether it was necessary to use the atomic weapons. But Niels Bohr, B-O-H-R, opposed the weapons. So did Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard, A-R-D. But the Pentagon did not oppose it. They didn't heed their opinion. In 1944, that's 1 year before the war was over and 1 year after the Nazis had gone underground, the so-called ALSOS mission, A-L-S-O-S mission, was a scientific intelligence body, was set up to accompany the advancing troops of the United States and collect data on the uranium project and find their researchers and take them to the United States. Among them were SS Sturmfuhrer Werner von Braun, who has later played a leading role in the multi-stage ballistic missiles, and former Nazi Colonel General Walter Dornberger, creator of the cruise missile. On June 16, 1945, on the evening of the Potsdam Conference, Truman knew what we were going to do and how we would use the bomb. On August the 6th, that's the anniversary this evening, And August the 9th, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were dropped without any military necessity whatsoever. But the important thing about this new book is that the same people, Wernher von Braun and General Dornberger, were being rounded up as early as 1945 through this particular group that was going along with the troops and gathering the scientists. We know that Reinhard Gehlen was salting away the names of his particular agents, but these men were part of the plan to come to this country and work on the bomb and the delivery system, like we have deployed the missiles now with the atomic warheads on them. So what you have is this Walter Dornberger then went to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He employed Michael Payne at Bell Helicopter. Payne was the host of Lee Harvey Oswald. And Wernher von Braun is mentioned in the Torbett document in the story of the assassination cabal, working with the Defense Industry Security Command. These two men have been named as a part in the murder of John Kennedy, and Alan Dulles of the Warren Commission was arranging for them to sweep up the scientists, these particular people related to the atomic bomb, and Henry Stimson, the power behind Herbert Hoover, and John J. McCloy was part of that decision in the White House, so that while people were meeting at the United Nations and trying to think that we would have a world of peace, it was already decided what we would use the bomb for, to blackmail the Russians, and how we would use it. Now, in addition to the anniversary of the atomic bombs being dropped, this week is the anniversary of Richard Nixon leaving the White House. August the 8th is the date that he left the White House. There was a series on television out here, and maybe nationally, I don't know, 3-hour on Richard Nixon and the impeachment hearing, 1 hour on the impeachment hearing, and 3 hours on the Watergate story and how it unraveled. But there's certain points of the Watergate story I want to bring out because it is the anniversary, August the 8th, when Nixon left the White House. The first thing is that James McCord was on television briefly, and they did not say on this version of the movie when he was introduced to break the Watergate story in March of 1973. He said, "I have with me Bernard Fensterwald, who is from the Committee to Investigate Assassinations." Bernard Fensterwald was at my home in September 1970, and I have a reason to know, and of course everybody who studies him knows his role with the Central Intelligence Agency now and before. He represents Mary Ann Paisley, the widow of John Paisley. He was McCord's attorney. He was James Earl Ray's attorney, the man charged with killing Martin Luther King. Also, that was the first break in the Watergate story, was when McCord started talking. Also, they had John Dean on television telling how he believed that there were tapes in the White House and how Alexander Butterfield had taped the president. And they just passed that up just kind of casually, and the role of Alexander Haig in bringing Butterfield from Australia when Richard Nixon was elected and saying, "Come on in, we need you in the White House." They called him just a low-level employee who works for Federal Aviation. They didn't say that his job was in the White House until the Dorothy Hunt plane crash went down. Then he was switched to be head of Federal Aviation while he investigated what was an outright murder of a CIA bag lady. And some of you know this history and some of you don't, and it bears repeating in case you forgot it. Now, in the Henry Kissinger book, The Years of Upheaval, published in 1982 by Little Brown, it's his story of the White House Watergate years. And in there, there's a couple of sentences that are very pertinent to Henry Kissinger in this his period in the White House as National Security Advisor. It said that when, in the growing loneliness, when Nixon needed a keeper at the gate, he was there to help him. You can imagine. It was reflected, his loneliness and how to handle him was reflected in the decision to bring in Alexander Haig to replace Robert Haldeman as the Chief of Staff. Al Haig and I, that's Kissinger, were long friends. He was my assistant in the National Security Council. He says, when it came time for a chief of staff in the White House, an old mentor, Fritz Kramer, came up with the name of Alexander Haig, Jr., who was then a colonel on the staff at West Point. He was also strongly recommended by Joe Califano and Robert McNamara. Califano, I mentioned his name in relationship to Grenada and to a lot of other matters on the, even helping Geraldine Ferraro with her electoral committee efforts for Congress in Queens. Whether or not she knows what he is, I don't know, but he was the person who, from the Defense Department, wanted Haig. And this is when the Pentagon became the chief of staff in the White House. Now, Butterfield had bugged the president, and so with the help of Haig and Kissinger and his mentor, Fritz Kramer, that I talk about so much, they were the second stage in bringing the president out. Now, what did you get after they slid the president out? You got Gerald Ford from the Warren Commission, and you got Nelson Rockefeller, who never could have been elected a vice president, and old Carl Albert was bypassed, and they had their old cronies in. Now, there was another man on the television this week who you might or might not have seen. He was Mr. BENZ, B-E-N-Z, and he's the fellow that spoke up to Sam Ervin and said, well, didn't the Democrats steal the election in 1960 and 68, talking about the close vote in Chicago that was questionable about John Kennedy. And Sam Ervin said, I don't know much about that. But I want to read you from the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaigns a few sentences about the Mr. BENZ, B-E-N-Z, the guy who was on the television, because whenever these things are televised, they don't really get to what the congressional hearings were saying. And it's important that he refers to a Donald Segretti who was at Fort Ord, California. The testimony of Mr. BENZ, part of it, this is Book 2 of the Senate Presidential Campaign Activities, the Select Committee investigating the 93rd Congress. This is Phase 2, October the 4th and 9th, 1973. They asked Mr. BENZ, he's from Lutz, Florida, he's a dock superintendent, he's the president of the Young Republicans in Texas. Did you receive a phone call from a man who identified himself as Donald Simmons in 1971? And he said yes. And then he said that was an alias for Donald Segretti, who was in California. He was stationed at Fort Ord, California, legal department. Shortly after you agreed to work for Simmons, you received a letter saying California instructions. That's right, from California. Basically, it was a letter saying that I acquire pickets for the rallies that President Nixon might attend in the area. And they did dirty tricks and forged letters and so forth. Who were those pickets that you were to have? They were to have, not tickets, they were to have pickets around the areas where, not only where President Nixon would be, but where the Democrats would be. Who were those pickets? One was Mr. Hearing, and there was a gentleman by the name of Duke. And Mr. Lenzer said to him, and who is this individual named Duke? Did you know his background? He said, they told me he was a former member of the Nazi Party. So the committee knew his background because they went right to the question of, do you know who he is? And these men handed out letterheads of various members of the Congress, Senators Jackson and Humphrey, who are both dead now. They were targeted then, and they're both dead now. Lenzer, now, did Segretti give you, as part of your campaign dirty tricks, 3 vials of chemical substance in March of 72? That's correct. He instructed me to locate the liquid substance in the headquarters of Senator Muskie, 2 headquarters in Tampa, at a picnic. He told me, place them in those headquarters, and they said, could you get in? He said you could throw them or do whatever you had to do with the chemicals. In one building, there was a hole in the window. They dropped the substance through. In another building, it was told by me the screen was open, the window was open to drop in the chemicals. Now, they don't say what the chemical was or what it did to these people or anyone in the room, but this is a lawyer working for the United States Army at Fort Ord who's giving chemicals to this man to do dirty tricks at the time of the election at Watergate. It says, did you place them at a picnic? Yes, they took them to the picnic. It was a Senator Muskie picnic, and they emptied the vial at the picnic. Where was it held? On the grounds of the Mary Help of Christians Church School. That's where it was, the chemical. Getting back to the picnic where the chemical was distributed, do you recall what the FBI agents who interviewed you said about the picnic? And did you attend the picnic? He says he didn't attend it. He went there, left the vials of chemicals, and doesn't say what they were supposed to do or how you received the chemicals or what the audience got out of it. But they were some purpose because you're getting calls and letters and you're being paid a salary to put chemicals there. I bring this evidence up because I keep saying how people are chemically altered individually, by groups, attending groups. This happens to be a very innocent church group. Now, Mr. Talmadge said, I believe you had two subordinates. One was Mr. Duke and the other was named Mr. Hearing. Yes, his name was Duke. Okay, did Mr. Hearing tell you that Duke was a former SS officer for Adolf Hitler's stormtroopers? Correct, he did. Talmadge said, did you feel that being trained by Adolf Hitler and his stormtroopers particularly qualified him for the duties that you assigned to him? I don't know of any training school that would train him for this work, Ben said. And Talmadge said, were not the activities similar? Did not Hitler's Nazi stormtroopers perform similar activities to what you were engaged in Florida? He said, I don't know. And Talmadge said, well, you've read history of the period, haven't you? You've read the rise and fall of the Third Reich. Are not the activities of the Nazi stormtroopers somewhat similar? He said, I don't recall. And Talmadge said, I thought they were. I read a good many about falsified documents of that era, about libels and slander against the opposition. It was one of the ways I recall that Adolf Hitler came to power. And Sam Irvin said, you mean to tell me that you sincerely believe that you were justified in disseminating false and scurrilous attacks? He doesn't even mention the poison or the chemical on the character of Senator Jackson and Humphrey just to get Richard Nixon elected. And that was part of the Watergate hearings that is never on television. The parts left out, always left out. Who were the stormtroopers that were recruited by Donald Segretti, an attorney at Fort Ord? Now I get into a personal thing that I have to bring up at this time, and I mentioned a little bit on the talk show that preceded this. Through the years, various things have happened to our family, and I have two cassettes that are available for you. I haven't updated it, but they're available. And this last week, my son, on his answering machine, got 3 calls, one with a background of birds with a smart aleck reference to something that he didn't know about. The second was a woman's voice saying that we are going to kill you, that you're followed everywhere, every night, and you're going to be killed. Now, we have had a lot of things happen to the family, and my children are not paranoid considering so many things that have happened. And afterwards, or during the week, my son was at the house, and I got several phone calls, work-related to what I was doing. And he said, for goodness sakes, get off the air. Don't continue this on the air. You're obviously rustling up too many people at this time with these programs about Edwin Meese III and Ronald Reagan's appointments. And he says, I don't want to be bloodied, laid out, because of this one more time. There are other people out there, and our family has paid their dues. Now, I mentioned Bernard Fensterwald, the attorney for James McCord at the Watergate hearings. He was the one that stood by him and represented him. Fensterwald was at my home in September 1970, and about 6 weeks later was the car accident that my daughter was killed in, and the other daughter was almost killed. The accident involved a soldier from Fort Ord, where Donald Segretti was stationed, and I read you particularly the testimony of his working with the SS stormtroopers. Segretti was at Fort Ord. The gentleman involved who walked away from this accident, where 3 people were killed and 6 were badly wounded, was at Fort Ord. He left within days or hours and went back to Salt Lake City to Utah. And I have some pieces of the puzzle, but it's believe it or not, it's still too hurting to get into the details of this thing. When Watergate broke, the men were hired. James McCord, G. Gordon Liddy, and Segretti's money all came out of Mullen Associates, the public relations office in Washington, linked to the CIA and the Defense Department and to Salt Lake City, Utah, to former Representative Bennett and the Mormon connections, the Utah connections, and the Howard Hughes organization in Utah. And this is where this fellow went, Mr. Garcia, right after the accident. So the Watergate thing came to mind, and also many of you know the letter in 1967 that the FBI wrote to various agencies that I got from Freedom of Information Act, that information about me should be sent to the Department of Justice and the United States Secret Service and the attention of the General Investigative Agency because Mrs. Brussell, in quotes, in the past expressed great alarm over the fact that the United States is becoming fascist. She pictures America as controlled by conspirators in the government, which view she stated publicly. Well, you on the air are my public audience. They said due to her thinking that she has said publicly, Dallas and San Francisco are to incorporate this information into their letterheads for dissemination to the Department and U.S. Secret Service. So since 1967, I have been under their surveillance. And also Bruce Roberts, who wrote the Gemstone File, wrote about the car accident. Before I knew him, he had written who set up the car accident and the names of the people. Incidentally, the powers that be in Washington had used some mafia figures in San Jose whose names are identified. And the first call that my son got this week said, you ordered 4 pizza, and where in the heck are you? You didn't buy them. And the pizza business and the mozzarella cheese are strongly linked even to those areas that we tangled with before. Coincidental, maybe. Making a lot out of nothing, I don't know. But all the years that I have been on the air, the family have not asked me to slow down. There was a time when I did go off the air and the tapes went on continuously. I've been on for 13 years, but I did it by subscription, and I'll be doing it again by subscription. And at that time, a lot of things were happening around me, and the girls were acting in a play at the Barnyard Theater here. And a fellow by the name of Mr. Selmeyer was managing the theater, and his brother Dean wanted to work there. Well, in 1979, just the time when I was under pressure, and I went back on the air in 1980 because Ronald Reagan was going to become the Fuhrer, and I wanted to speak out about the intricacies and Gestapo connections of Reagan. In 1979, Viking Press came out with a book that I've mentioned on other broadcasts called Blow Away, by Dean Selmeyer and Mark Cram. And the book describes a man, it says this is the autobiography of a professional killer who decided to go public. He's not a pseudonym, it's a stage and screen actor. He kills for a living. He got in trouble when in the armed forces, and he was offered a chance to get out of the Army and a long hitch in the prison if he was willing to take a lethal assignment. So under the cover of being an actor, he was in the Broadway show, The Ballad of the Sad Cafe. He went around killing people as a paid killer. Well, Donald Segretti was in the Army, and he could release people from the Army, the brig there, and other Army officials, release people caught on drugs or other things and say, if you will do killings of particular people for us, we will get you out of the Army prison. So he was acting in Broadway plays, and he was hanging people on meat hooks. Now, just coincidentally, I got a letter from his first cousin this week. She was in Los Angeles and read about my father's passing away and sent me a condolence call. I know his brother up on the peninsula, and his nephew took a course that we taught at Monterey Peninsula College on the American assassinations. This is a home product from the Monterey Peninsula, and at the time he wanted to work at the theater where my girls were was the time when I didn't know him. I knew his brother and I knew the history, but I was feeling uncomfortable. Also in the Monterey Herald this last week is an article, Edwin Meese will be exonerated, his lawyer says. Edwin Meese's attorney was in Monterey just last week talking to a group of the Monterey County Bar Association at the Holiday Inn. Now that's a local group, and on our peninsula we have 2 of the most important attorneys in the United States in terms of what I'm doing. There's Melvin Belli, whose offices are about a block and a half from this station, who is now representing the lawsuit against the Soviet Union on the Korean airline. He's very anti-Russian. He was Jack Ruby's attorney, and he's right here in this area, and I'm doing broadcasts week after week and writing articles on the kamikaze provocateur setup of the Korean airline for the kind of propaganda which he, in fact, is continuing. And John McCone of the CIA, he was director of the CIA. He was on the board of ITT when they coaxed Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon to kill Salvador Allende to keep the price of copper up in Chile. The board of the copper companies wants their big profit, and the telephone wires come from that copper. I'm not blaming these people, but what I'm saying is that there's a whole lot of people around here, attorneys. Mr. McCone's a Knight of Malta, along with Alexander Haig and William Casey, and strong, the Vatican connections. The areas that I'm hitting are not separate from the area that I'm talking about. I happen to be living in a nest of people that I assume don't want to touch me, but I assume if I went too far could do harm to my children, because it's happened already. And it's happened once. One was poisoned, one was killed, and one was almost killed. So I have to pull back. As I say, the attorney for Edwin Meese, E. Robert Waller, coincidentally just happened to be here on the Monterey Peninsula. He flew in from Washington, D.C. He said the political flap over Meese's nomination has faded from the headlines, and our greatest success so far has been removing it from the media. We'll take a 1-minute break and then go back to that subject. This station next week. This is side 2 of the broadcast 661, August the 6th, 1984. As I say, Edwin Meese's attorney was here, saying in Monterey, because we're a small town and it doesn't travel, we've had a great success. If we remove the name from the media, then as soon as Reagan is reelected, Meese will be your attorney general. It doesn't matter about all the favoritism or anything that went on. Just wait a while and sit it out. And the New York Times had a story July 31st, minding the store from a distance, and it's about Ed Meese, who was staying in the White House, sort of like Paul Marcinkus at the Vatican, that he's staying close. He isn't appearing in Congress. Since April, when an independent counsel was named, he has shunned the public eye. Reagan's trying to get these important bills through Congress, but Meese isn't seen. He's going to remain in Washington and not get much attention where somebody can yell a question at him. But Edwin Meese's son is stationed at Fort Ord. I mentioned it before. He's a graduate of West Point. He's stationed at Fort Ord. And I don't know whether or not he listens to these broadcasts or not, but Donald Segretti was stationed at Fort Ord when he was ordering the stormtroopers and the chemicals and a lot of dangerous substances distributed and dangerous people distributed. There were Watergate deaths, about 30 that I wrote about at one time, deaths immediately after and during the whole Watergate process. Of the major witnesses were all off. So this is a team that you have to realize are playing for real. The stakes are high, and you sit back and try to praise. You couldn't guess which one or groups or who makes decisions, but I have a pretty good idea. Now, to update a few more stories, and if possible, get to the Reagan appointments. If not, there are things I do want to get into the news that we have talked about to update before we lose them. I'm sure you saw on television or read the testimony of Mr. Scotty, Gerald V. Scotty, in terms of the DeLorean case that's now gone to the jury. Scotty claimed that there was a decision made, he worked for the DEA for 10 years, on where to arrest DeLorean. They didn't know whether to do it in New York or Los Angeles, but according to the New York Times, Scotty said someone said something to the effect that this thing is going clear to the White House, that they have Meese in on it. Remember, I talked about Edwin Meese and the DeLorean prosecution and questions about the Meese family and the tangled web of John DeLorean. Well, of course, Meese would deny this. I have nothing to do with this. But Mr. Scotty wouldn't make that up. And he said that Meese was involved in the decision of where to arrest him was taken from Washington, D.C. They didn't know where to arrest him. Now, Mr. Scotty, as I say, worked 10 years with the Drug Enforcement Agency. He was involved in a large arrest in Los Angeles and Miami, a $25 million bust of the Grandma Mafia cocaine charge. And because of certain information he allegedly had let somebody off the hook or informed them, tipped off a person, an attorney, that an associate was going to be investigated by the DEA. So there was some scandal about Scotty. But Scotty may also be blowing the John DeLorean case now by the testimony he gave at the case. He may also be helping the government now to get DeLorean off, where the real intention at one time was to frame him. they said they would get his picture in Time magazine, and of course Claire Luce, whose husband was the owner, editor of Time, is on the board of Robert Keith Gray. And I want to just diagram for you once again my allegations about DeLorean and the story about Edwin Meese connections. In the Los Angeles Herald in 1982, in November, that's almost 2 years ago, there's an article about John DeLorean. The profit consumed by his expenses in New York was $40,000 a month. The New York office spent $10 million a year. The daily expenses of Irvine, California were $50,000 to $500,000 a day. DeLorean was so busy he was trying to diversify himself. He was worth $75 million at the time. He wasn't worrying about the car company. He was negotiating with a Utah company, that snow grooming company, where $7 million hasn't been accounted for, and negotiating with the Chrysler, the bus company belonging to Chrysler, and also with a maritime company that operated the ocean-going vessels. And I wondered if the maritime company was in any way linked with Edwin Wilson and his multi-leveled CIA maritime company and the Nugan Bank. All of these shenanigans have been left out of the trial. All of this money, the missing millions, the 17 million in Europe or from the Panama banks, the 60 million that Great Britain put into the car company, the 7 million in the Utah company, all of that, it doesn't exist anymore. It's in all the papers, and good investigators found, but forget it now, it doesn't happen. Well, why would Ed Meese want to be interested in prosecuting DeLorean? We've gone into that before. Why would they promise a picture to these men that DeLorean would be covered on Time? What was so important? The only thing, I repeat again, was the information I got about DeLorean's links to Mengele, that Joseph Mengele was supposed to have been brought home by certain members who were hired to do it, and Mr. Hetrick was flying those planes, but he was arrested on a drug charge and later he wanted to protect his son and Edwin Wilson's son. Edwin Wilson worked with Robert Keith Gray, with George Bush, with Henry Kissinger in Task Force 157, and maybe they didn't want Edwin Wilson's name. You know, since Edwin Wilson's two primary witnesses were killed, his name hasn't been in the news in about a year and a half. Since the DeLorean trial or anything is going on, Edwin Wilson worked with Robert Keith Gray. On the board is Claire Luce of Time magazine, and the mentioning of Meese in the testimony earlier and at this time has a possible link back to these offices of Gray and Wilson and Task Force 157, and particularly with the cover-up of the maritime company that DeLorean wanted to go into, because that's what Edwin Wilson was using as his front for the CIA. Now, the same fellows that wanted to bring Mengele in from South America that were tangled to this weren't successful. Mengele would have to be killed. He's carefully guarded, so it didn't work. But the Joseph Mengele story was in the Washington Post, and David Emery sent me a version which I didn't see in my paper. It was there evidently. I read it too fast. It's about the Nazi fugitive Joseph Mengele, and this is the first time I've seen it in print, except for what I had on my broadcast on World Watchers, on these programs and on the tapes. And I want to show you what Jack Anderson does with it in the Washington Post. The Monterey Herald and the San Francisco Chronicle carried the same story and left out these two paragraphs about Joseph Mengele that were printed in Washington. He tells about the aliases that Mengele had, that Mengele allegedly flew into Miami, that he was tipped off and left before they could arrest him. And Jack Anderson says, and we've had this before, this is what he says, in 1966, the FBI learned that a man named Joseph Mengele, that's the angel of death from Auschwitz who decided who should live or die and did the experiments, medical experiments in the concentration camp where John Paul II was working for I.G. Farben at the time. He says in 1966, the FBI learned that a man named Joseph Mengele, a U.S. citizen, was a Nazi Party member in America, and as a result was the subject of a denaturalization proceeding, according to a confidential memo. The FBI was told by an informer they wanted Nazi war criminal Joseph Mengele, who was masquerading under the name of Harold Endemann and resided in Riviera, Arizona. and it tells how he dyed his hair and had plastic surgery, which was supposed to have been done at Colonia Dignidad earlier. For a while, the FBI apparently thought it located the authentic angel of death, but like so many other leads and rumors about Mengeles, this one quietly crumbled into dust. Now, it crumbled into dust because nobody will pick it up. Jack Anderson or the Justice Department or the FBI or the people in Miami who are screaming the loudest. The actual FBI report, which I've had on the air many times, and I have a copy here, dated December the 8th, 1966, says that a man stopped in the office of an attorney in Las Vegas and advised that Nazi war criminal Mengeles was masquerading in this country. But the important thing is that the FBI blocks out the name of the people who informed them and the name of the FBI agent, but they have those names in Washington, so we could certainly ask them to do more work. It says Mengeles was naturalized on December the 5th, 1932, in the U.S. District Court in New York City under certificate number, and it's blacked out. The Los Angeles office has no information concerning the results of whether he was denaturalized. Now, if you wanted to solve this problem, if the Anti-Defamation League, if the Jewish organizations, if Simon Wiesenthal wanted to solve this problem, and they claim there's two Mengeles, they should come up with the Mengeles that the FBI man knew about. If he was naturalized, they have his date and they have his number. What country did he come from? Where did the other one come from? That he was, that they want to take away his citizenship. If he got his naturalization citizenship in December of 32, he had to come from somewhere other than the United States. What territory on planet Earth did this man come from? And if they wanted to take away his citizenship, what state was the other Mengeles living in? Find what other state. And the third question is, where is he today? Where is the man today? And they can't come up with anybody but the German, like Dr. Urban, who was naturalized in San Francisco. He joined the Gestapo in Germany, came to the United States and was naturalized, then went back to Europe and recruited people like Errol Flynn and the Gestapo, rubbing off with Ronald Reagan at Warner Brothers. And the point is that they passed this off as dust because, one, the subject of denaturalization came, but two, they have the actual when he was naturalized. Now, all you have to do is get the fingerprints and the basis of origin. Where did he come from? Peru in the 30s? No. What country? He came from Germany. That's where he came from, because I told you before, a friend of mine named David sat with him in the Honduras. I've said this over and over. Sat with him in the Honduras and sent for this memo. Now, Charles Spears in Texas transcribes these tapes on World Watchers and sends them to 30 or 40 or 50 people every week, and one of the recipients is Jack Anderson, who was on the board of the Reverend Moon Bank in Washington, D.C., and plays a good investigative role and then a backward role. He does sort of the backward step like Michael Jackson. Now, he gets a transcript of these tapes, and he knows from reading what Charles Spears sends him that I am telling you and the world about this particular Mengele. So when it turns out that he is in the United States and visiting, and Life magazine had an article about him visiting, and he is directly linked to Klaus Barbie and the cocaine traffic and the South American death squads of Licio Gelli, Anderson has the need or the order in return for documents that he prints and gets a reputation for having. He has to put down that this went to dust. This has never been investigated. The Jewish organizations have told me it's a different Mengeles, but they won't come up with any proof of any kind on the matter. Now, there's a few deaths I want to talk about this week, and then I said I'm going back next week onto the appointments. For those of you who have the tapes, the appointments of Ronald Reagan and continuing where I left off, and then the Henry Kissinger links to the British Nazi connections. Several weeks ago, on June the 11th, that was broadcast 653, I was talking about certain people who had died. One of them was Thomas Pillsbury, who worked on the Manhattan Project, who was swept away in a Colorado River, and who had bad feelings about the atomic bomb and was going to the Soviet Union to try to make peace, who had reversed feelings, who went swept away in a river. I also talked about Robert Boettcher, Boettcher, On the staff, he was the chief of the House investigation into Reverend Moon and Tongsun Park. That I had the staff of congressional investigator of the South Korean scandal of Tongsun Park from 1971 to 79, executive director of the Dance Theater of Harlem that fell out of a roof, Central Park. He was 44 years old. What I didn't make the connection, except from another person who told me, and I guess there's so much news, either I'm getting older or inundated with news or both. Butcher is the fellow who wrote the book Gifts of Deceit, the book about Reverend Moon and their links to the government and their organizations and to the Central Intelligence Agency. I didn't make the connection, and thanks to a very astute listener, they reminded me, and I do have the book. There are people like Mr. Blair, who wrote about the oil conspiracy, who died within weeks of when the book came out. Mr. Borkin, who wrote The Crime and Punishment of I.G. Farben, died right after the book came out. I'm doing a series of authors, attorneys, judges, congressional investigators, CIA. A man like this falls into 3 or 4 classifications. In Gifts of Deceit, the book is described, it describes Butcher as a staff of the House Subcommittee on International Relations. He was in on the Korean scandal. He was in liaison with top officials of the CIA, the Department of State, the Justice, Special Counsel Leon Jaworski, who's from the Warren Commission, and was on the Ethics Committee, the staff of the Ethics Committee investigation. He also was expert in Far Eastern languages at Georgetown University and worked 5 years in the Foreign Service with Donald Fraser, congressman from Minneapolis, who was Minnesota, who was defeated by the Moon people who ganged up on him. He was an expert on Reverend Moon. He is described, when I read back on the book and looked into the book, he was the one who made the connections to the Korean CIA, to our CIA, to the support of Richard Nixon, and the meddling in U.S. policies and Moon's front organizations and his breaking the First Amendment freedoms. And he was showing out how millions of dollars were put into political action by a man from Korea, South Korea, who was affecting our right of the Constitution for free speech. And he was talking about the chance of bribery and corruption and coercion, repeated again because it's woven into the fabric of our society in Washington right now. Now that's the fellow, just to update that story, that I had. He passed away flying out of a building, like so many people, Ralph Bunche and a lot of other important people that fly out of buildings. Another death that you might have read this week, Representative Carl Perkins, a veteran liberal, dies at age 71. He was the most important liberal in the Congress, a very quiet man. You didn't know him. He was chairman of the House Education and Labor Committee since 1967. The San Francisco Chronicle says he was one of the strongest committee chairmen in all of Congress. He devoted his entire energy into recent years to fighting the budget cuts proposed by President Reagan. Perkins' success succeeded in some instances and lost in the other. He said, "I've worked for years for the welfare of people, and now the Reagan administration is tearing it apart. I'm seeing practically everything dismantled. I'm not just going to vote to destroy these programs." He says, that is what they want to do, and I'm not going to let them do it. I'm going to fight it. Well, he was on an airplane he's from Lexington, Kentucky. He was going to Washington. He got sick on the plane. He didn't feel good. He arrived dead in Washington, D.C. He's a person who was up for re-election. It's an election year. His seat was open. He was running without Republican opposition. Remember when John Warner won a seat in the Senate after the plane crash of the man who defeated him in the primary, and he's been in the very important position in the Senate ever since. Next door neighbor to Edwin Wilson, who devoted himself to making the missiles that down airplanes for airplane crashes, and Frank Turple expertised himself with chemicals you put on the arms or clothing of people, particularly walking down the aisle of an airplane, and they drop dead. It gets into the blood system, and they have what's an apparent heart attack. Well, he was delivered dead on arrival as chairman of the important committee, and he worked hard. Some of the things he did are legislation for aid to schools, not religious schools, other schools, college student assistance, child nutrition, coal mine safety, aid to the crippled children, labor measures, the first labor for the coal miners in his area. He dropped dead just this past week, and he will be missed in Congress, a very quiet man who seemed to be getting his work done. Another quiet man who died at a convention with a bunch of people in Paris, Gilbert RENAULT, R-E-N-A-U-L-T. He was the organizer of the Free French Intelligence against Klaus Barbie, who's still sitting there for 2 years and hasn't gone to trial. He died of an apparent heart attack on the time he attended an anniversary with the resistance fighters who fought against the Nazis in France. He didn't show up at the party, the breakfast meeting, and they went to his hotel room and he was dead. In 1948, he wrote a book, Memoirs of a Secret Agent of Free France. He used the alias, or the pseudonym Remy, R-E-M-Y. Probably in 1948, he knew that the Nazis still had death squads, and he wrote it under an assumed name and didn't feel free then. He went to England and during the war, and then came back and worked the cloak and dagger work. He went behind the lines and provided intelligence, saw many of his friends killed. He was a banking executive who went to a reunion of his buddies and was dead at the time of the reunion. Sure, he's 79. He's a nice, ripe age, but it's a time of the Klaus Barbie trial coming up. Mr. Perkins was 71. But a lot of those Watergaters, you see, those villains, they'll live to be a ripe old age and not dying of these apparent heart attacks at a time that they're an important meeting. Just when a trial is coming up, there's an election coming up, and Perkins is running for the House of Representatives again, a clear winner, and he dies, and a clear opponent of everything Reagan stands for. And again, at a time when the Nazis are getting a foothold, a fighter of the resistance goes to reunion, the leader of the resistance, and he's dead. Now, the next man who died this last week wasn't killed, and he's no hero. He's Colonel Edward GLAVIN, G-L-A-V-I-N. But a very important man. He died. He was 81 years old and died last Wednesday in a hospital in Norwalk, Connecticut. They didn't give the reason, but I'm sure this one wasn't murdered. He attended West Point University, and then he went to London, and it's very important. This school, Balliol College, B-A-L-L-I-O-L College at Oxford, is very important for American espionage, and then he went on to be a military attaché at the American Embassy in London. Now, Colonel GLAVIN was the man in charge of negotiating the secret surrender that I talked about in the first part of this program, where the Nazis are getting ready with their atomic bombs and their intelligence to work for the United States. He helped with the surrender of 1 million troops in northern Italy to the United States. He delivered May 2nd, 1945, from SS Karl Wolff, who was running the Treblinka concentration camps while he was working with Allen Dulles, both in the OSS, GLAVIN and Dulles in the OSS. Dulles later on the Warren Commission with John McCloy, always going back to the Kennedy assassinations, whether it's Wernher von Braun and Walter Dornberger with the atomic bomb and the plans for the next war, Reinhard Gehlen's agents in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, or Mr. GLAVIN making the secret surrender with Wolff and Allen Dulles, again on the Warren Commission with the Kennedy. This was America's real coup. Now, the importance of this man is not only was he instrumental in being the liaison between SS Karl Wolff, who Wolff was the man, the go-between between Adolf Hitler and Mr. Heinrich Himmler, but he went on after the war. He was placed with the United States Army Information Service in Frankfurt, Germany, in the Army Education Program of the United States. This is the New York Times. There were other obituaries, but nobody stated it so well as the New York Times. He worked for the United States Army Education Program at Frankfurt, Germany. Parts of the program had the goal of raising the education level of United States troops and to make them aware that the war was over and that, in quotes, hate Germans attitude or personal retribution against Germans would no longer be tolerated in the United States Army. This is when they're opening up Dachau or Treblinka that SS Karl Wolff from the Secret Surrender was running at the time he was working with this very man. His role, the American role, was to teach the GIs who saw what was going on. This may have been the largest mass brainwashing of American troops to not repulse them against what they saw as against what they should feel. He was to make them aware that it would not be tolerated to hate Germans, and that was immediately after the war in Frankfurt, Germany. Well, Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger were over there instructing the top Nazis on how to get ready to work for the United States government and then get out to South America if they need be with the OSS and the CIA money. Now, after he retired in 1955, he went on to work for New York University, the college, fundraising. Coincidentally, Norman Redlich, the Warren Commission counsel, is now chief of law school at New York University. If you raise enough money for the university and you want certain people to run the law department, just like Mr. Liebler is the head of the law department, one of the professors or the head of the law department at UCLA, the attorneys from the Warren Commission in strategic places. Now, another murder that I want to discuss, and getting back close to home, it was in the San Jose Mercury this week, August the 2nd. Reputed Hawaiian hitman pleads guilty to 4 murders. And I bring this in because this is a current murder. Honolulu, a hitman state that he killed 4 people, among them a state senator and the son of a city prosecutor. He killed Charles Marshland III, the 19-year-old son of Honolulu prosecuting attorney Charles F. Marshland Jr. So the target for one of the 4 murders for the mafia in Hawaii was a state senator and the son of a man who was prosecuting for the city. So you see, if I have feelings about going off the air at this time, I can relate to what I read in the paper, that they do in fact hit sons. If you don't believe it, read your morning paper. Now, I want one other article, if I have time to get on, from the Washington Post. We'll do that quickly, and then I'll tell you how you can obtain tapes of these broadcasts. I will be making them, and they will be going out. You send me a letter with a self-addressed stamped envelope to Mae Brussell, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel 93922. And I will tell you how to get the tapes and how to pool. If there's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people that want to spend $1 a week and to pool their money, you can obtain these broadcasts. I don't know how long I'll be off the air. I don't know what the pressures are. In the last few weeks, there have been pressures here. I was taking the tape of the broadcast that I take as soon as I'm off the air and leave it at the tape center on Forest Avenue, 2 blocks away. And several weeks ago at 9 in the evening, where there's about 1 car every minute on that street, it's not a major thoroughfare, there was a man directly in front of the tape center, a large, heavy-set man. It looked like that Mr. Keneally from the Nazi party that I'd seen in L.A., that type, of a leather jacket, mean-looking, about 45 years old, and his arms were crossed, and the slot that I put the tapes in at the door was, he just completely covered the door waiting, and I pulled up. And it happened that my son, the one that got the death threats, was meeting me for dinner about 3 blocks up the street that evening, and I motioned to him, and we went on and parked my car somewhere and went back, and he was still there. We went out to dinner somewhere else and came back, and he was gone. There was somebody in the lobby here at the station a few weeks ago, sort of, it looked like an E. Howard Hunt hobo down at the bottom of the stairs, and I didn't know whether to come back to the station or go on to the car, and I went to the car and waited, and later he had this package of stuff that was laid out all over the floor, and he sort of ran down the street and left. I guess he thought I might stay there forever, and I was willing to do that. But there's been some weird things going on, so the phone call alone would be reason enough to stop, but I want to mention that there have been other things going on. Now, finally, there is an article in the Washington Post, July 23rd, Doctors Post-Mortem. It's about Dr. Dixon, Dr. Douglas Dixon of Washington, D.C. It says he's the 5th Washington medical examiner to leave the city in the last 18 months. He said he was resigning because of political considerations. He said he's forced to say suicides are accidents, to have autopsies were none that warranted, and once when he wanted an autopsy on the murder of a rabbi in Washington, D.C., recently murdered, they wouldn't let him do it. The office wouldn't let him do it. He said there was a time during the day when the rabbi was murdered when I was prepared to take off my gloves and walk out, resigning not only the acting chief but as deputy medical examiner in protest over what are extremely dangerous, meddling examples in Washington, D.C. Now, that's the city where I said when Reagan was to be president, the murders would be rampant, and if you listen every week, you know they are. He said he's leaving this office. There's 3 positions have been vacant out of 6. They've been political positions. People have left there, and walked out. The deputies have walked out of this office. Now, if the good guys leave, they will totally control the politics of the autopsies in Washington, D.C., which is what they want to do. And I mentioned the murder of the Synfuels investigator, Mr. Thomas Doherty, May the 6th, 1984, how he was killed and found in the river there, the Potomac River at Chesapeake Bay. No, it's the Potomac River that he was found floating in. And there was questions about his death, and he was the prime investigator that caused the head of the Synfuel organization to retire under investigation of financial mismanagements. Well, be kind, there were many millions of dollars missing out of a bank he was involved with in Oklahoma. But the chief investigator, Mr. Doherty, was found floating in the river. And this man says that the coroner's office in Washington, D.C. has become so political, and after the murder of the rabbi, he wanted to walk out. Well, the time is up. We've got to go now. I see it's, not time for the blues? Or are you doing the blues for us? Okay, well, this is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove. I'm about 1 minute over, so we'll close. For those of you who want to subscribe, you can take the tapes. It won't be live on the air for a while, but I will have a program of records, so you can keep listening next week.